Between 1882 and 1924, the Grimsley Children's Sanctuary in Salem, Massachusetts claimed to protect over 300 orphaned children, yet only 127 ever left alive. The Gothic stone building stood like a fortress against the Massachusetts countryside, its tall windows reflecting nothing but darkness even on the brightest days. Behind those walls, beneath the carefully maintained facade of Christian charity and progressive child welfare, the Grimsley family operated what survivors would later describe as a methodical system of human experimentation. Children arrived by train from across New England, their small hands clutching belongings that would be burned within hours. What happened next remained buried in sealed records for nearly a century, until a demolition crew in 1987 discovered the rooms that should never have existed. The institution's reputation, the Grimsley Children's Sanctuary, emerged from the ashes of America's Industrial Revolution when rapid urbanization left thousands of children orphaned or abandoned on city streets. In 1882, Dr. Cornelius Grimsley, a respected physician and social reformer, established what would become one of New England's most prestigious charitable institutions. Located on 47 acres of pristine Massachusetts woodland, the sanctuary promised to transform society's most vulnerable children into productive citizens through a revolutionary combination of moral instruction, practical education, and what Grimsley called progressive therapeutic intervention. Dr. Grimsley came from old Massachusetts money. His grandfather, Samuel Grimsley, had made the family fortune in textile manufacturing during the early 1800s, and his father, Judge William Grimsley, served on the Massachusetts Supreme Court for over 2 decades. Cornelius followed the family tradition of public service, graduating from Harvard Medical School in 1875 with highest honors. His doctoral thesis, Hereditary Moral Deficiency in the Urban Poor, established him as a leading voice in the emerging field of social medicine. The Massachusetts Medical Society honored him as Physician of the Year in 1881, just 1 year before he founded the sanctuary. The institution's board of directors read like a directory of Boston's elite families. Judge Harrison Lowell, descendant of the textile dynasty, served as chairman. Mrs. Catherine Appleton, whose husband controlled significant railroad interests, managed fundraising operations. Reverend Dr. Marcus Wheelwright, pastor of Boston's most influential congregational church, provided spiritual oversight. Together, they assembled an impressive roster of supporters, bank presidents, industrial magnates, prominent lawyers, and respected physicians, all contributed generously to what newspapers called the most noble experiment in child welfare ever attempted in New England. The sanctuary's public reputation gleamed like polished marble. Annual reports, distributed to donors and government officials, documented impressive statistics. Literacy rates among residents reached 93%, significantly higher than public schools. Medical examinations showed remarkable improvements in children's physical health. Behavioral assessments indicated dramatic reductions in what staff termed moral irregularities. Most compelling of all, the institution boasted a placement rate of 87%, meaning nearly 9 out of 10 children found permanent homes or employment upon leaving the facility. Dr. Grimsley published extensively in medical journals, sharing insights from his work with troubled youth. His 1889 article, Corrective Measures in Hereditary Behavioral Disorders, appeared in the prestigious American Journal of Social Medicine. The piece described innovative techniques for addressing what he classified as inherited moral deficiencies through systematic behavioral modification. Medical schools across the country invited him to lecture. Harvard, Yale, and Johns Hopkins all offered visiting professor positions, which he declined to focus on his work at the sanctuary. The facility itself impressed visitors with its modern amenities and thoughtful design. The main building, constructed of local granite in the Gothic Revival style, featured large windows to maximize natural light, central heating throughout, and indoor plumbing, luxuries many urban children had never experienced. Dormitories housed no more than 12 children each, with individual beds and personal storage space for belongings. The dining hall served 3 nutritious meals daily, prepared by professional cooks, following menus designed by Boston physicians. A fully equipped infirmary, staffed by trained nurses, provided immediate medical attention for any health concerns. Educational facilities rivaled those found in the finest private academies. The library contained over 3,000 volumes, including scientific texts, classical literature, and religious works carefully selected to promote moral development. Classrooms featured modern blackboards, adequate lighting, and comfortable seating. A workshop area taught practical skills, woodworking for boys, domestic arts for girls, and agricultural techniques for all residents. The curriculum emphasized both intellectual development and practical preparation for adult life. Religious instruction formed the cornerstone of the sanctuary's approach to child development. Daily chapel services began each morning, followed by Bible study periods and evening prayer sessions. Dr. Grimsley believed spiritual foundation provided essential structure for children from chaotic backgrounds. Reverend Dr. Wheelwright personally selected chaplains and designed religious programs specifically for the institution. Visiting ministers regularly praised the children's devotion and moral progress. Community support for the sanctuary remained strong throughout its early years. Local newspapers published glowing accounts of the institution's work. The Salem Herald's 1885 editorial proclaimed, "Dr. Grimsley's noble experiment proves that even the most disadvantaged children can be transformed through proper care and moral instruction. The sanctuary stands as a beacon of hope in our troubled times." The Boston Globe featured the facility in a special series on social reform, highlighting success stories of former residents who achieved respectable positions in society. Government officials frequently toured the facility, invariably expressing admiration for its operations. Massachusetts Governor Benjamin Butler visited in 1884, declaring the sanctuary a model for the entire nation. State legislators allocated additional funding for similar institutions across Massachusetts. Federal officials studied the facility's methods for potential implementation in other states. Dr. Grimsley's approach influenced child welfare policy throughout New England and beyond. The financial health of the institution appeared robust. Annual fundraising galas in Boston attracted hundreds of wealthy donors, regularly raising tens of thousands of dollars. Corporate sponsors included major banks, insurance companies, and manufacturing concerns. The state provided substantial subsidies for each child housed at the facility. Private foundations contributed grants for special programs and facility improvements. Dr. Grimsley's personal fortune, inherited from his family, supplemented institutional resources when needed. Professional recognition continued throughout the 1880s and 1890s. The American Medical Association awarded Dr. Grimsley its Distinguished Service Medal in 1892. Child welfare organizations across the country sought his advice on institutional design and program development. International visitors, including officials from England and Germany, toured the facility to observe American innovations in childcare. Medical journals regularly published articles describing the sanctuary's methods and achievements. The staff at the sanctuary reflected Dr. Grimsley's commitment to professional excellence. Head teachers held degrees from respected colleges and universities. Nurses received training at Boston's leading hospitals. Housemothers came from distinguished families with strong moral reputations. Administrative staff demonstrated proven experience in institutional management. Dr. Grimsley personally interviewed every employee, ensuring they shared his vision for transforming young lives through disciplined care and moral instruction. Success stories from former residents provided powerful testimonials to the institution's effectiveness. John Thompson, admitted in 1883 at age 7, graduated to become a successful businessman in Hartford, Connecticut. Mary Sullivan, who arrived as an 8-year-old in 1885, later married a respectable clerk and raised 4 children of her own. James Franklin, once considered incorrigible by previous institutions, completed his education at the sanctuary and secured employment with a prominent Boston law firm. These narratives, widely publicized in institutional literature, demonstrated the transformative power of Dr. Grimsley's methods. The sanctuary's influence extended beyond its immediate mission of childcare. Dr. Grimsley's writings shaped academic understanding of childhood development and social intervention. His theories about hereditary moral deficiency influenced legislation regarding juvenile justice and institutional care. Training programs at the sanctuary educated staff members who went on to establish similar institutions throughout New England. The facility served as a laboratory for developing innovative approaches to social problems that plagued rapidly industrializing America. By 1890, the Grimsley Children's Sanctuary stood as an unqualified success in the eyes of Massachusetts society. Professional journals praised its methods, government officials endorsed its approach, wealthy donors supported its mission, and former residents testified to its effectiveness. The Gothic granite building, surrounded by manicured grounds and filled with the sounds of children's voices, represented the very best of American social reform. Few could have imagined that behind this carefully constructed facade, something far darker was taking root in the Massachusetts soil. Ignored signs. The first troubling report came from an unlikely source. Reverend Dr. Marcus Wheelwright himself, the sanctuary's spiritual overseer and longtime supporter. In a confidential letter dated November 15, 1886, addressed to Judge Harrison Lowell, Wheelwright described disturbing observations during his regular visits to the facility. Children seemed unusually withdrawn during chapel services, he noted, showing what he termed an almost pathological fear of divine judgment. Several had approached him privately, attempting to share concerns about special lessons conducted by Dr. Grimsley, but their accounts proved so fragmented and seemingly fantastic that Wheelwright initially dismissed them as childish imagination. More concerning was the behavior he observed among the staff. Nurses and teachers displayed what Wheelwright characterized as nervous exhaustion and an unwillingness to discuss their daily routines in detail. When he inquired about specific children who had previously shown engagement during religious instruction, staff members provided evasive responses or claimed the children had been transferred to other programs. Wheelwright's letter concluded with a request for Judge Lowell to conduct a discreet inquiry into the facility's operations, though he emphasized his continued support for Dr. Grimsley's overall mission. Judge Lowell's response, preserved in the Grimsley family papers discovered decades later, revealed the board's reluctance to investigate their star institution. Lowell acknowledged Wheelwright's concerns, but attributed them to the natural challenges of working with severely damaged children. He reminded the Reverend that many residents arrived at the sanctuary after experiencing significant trauma, making unusual behavior unsurprising. The judge suggested that Wheelwright might benefit from consulting with Dr. Grimsley directly about child psychology, rather than drawing premature conclusions about institutional practices. The dismissal of Wheelwright's concerns established a pattern that would persist for nearly 4 decades. Warning signs accumulated steadily, but the institution's sterling reputation and the social standing of its supporters created a protective barrier around Dr. Grimsley's operations. Each troubling incident was explained away as an isolated occurrence, a misunderstanding, or the inevitable result of working with society's most challenging children. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, one of Boston's few female physicians, raised more specific concerns in 1888. During a consultation regarding a former sanctuary resident, she discovered what appeared to be unusual scarring on the child's back and arms. The mark suggested systematic infliction rather than accidental injury, but when Morrison attempted to question the child, he became violently agitated and refused to speak. Morrison contacted the Massachusetts Medical Society, requesting an investigation into the sanctuary's medical practices. The society's response proved disappointingly bureaucratic. Dr. Grimsley, as a respected member in good standing, deserved the presumption of professional competence. The scarring could result from any number of medical conditions or treatments. Without more definitive evidence of wrongdoing, the society saw no grounds for formal inquiry. Morrison was advised to focus on her current patient's needs, rather than pursuing what amounted to speculation about a colleague's methods. The matter was considered closed. Similar incidents multiplied throughout the late 1880s and early 1890s. Teachers in nearby schools reported that former sanctuary residents displayed unusual behavioral patterns: extreme deference to authority figures, reluctance to discuss their past experiences, and what one educator described as an almost military precision in following instructions. These children excelled academically, but struggled with social interactions, often isolating themselves from peers and showing little interest in typical childhood activities. Local law enforcement encountered their own puzzling cases. Salem police records from this period, rediscovered during a 1975 archive reorganization, documented multiple reports of children fleeing from the sanctuary grounds. These runaways were typically found within 24 hours, often in a state of severe distress and dehydration. When questioned about their reasons for leaving, the children provided inconsistent accounts that officers characterized as incoherent or obviously fabricated. Dr. Grimsley's explanations proved more compelling. These incidents represented normal reactions to institutional discipline among children unaccustomed to structured environments. The pattern of disappearances began to attract attention from unexpected quarters. Mrs. Agnes Hartwell, a Salem seamstress who occasionally provided services to the sanctuary, noticed discrepancies in the children she encountered during her visits. Faces that became familiar during weekly trips would suddenly vanish, replaced by new arrivals who seemed equally anxious and withdrawn. When she inquired about specific children, staff members claimed they had been successfully placed with families or transferred to specialized programs elsewhere. Mrs. Hartwell's growing suspicions led her to maintain an informal record of the children she observed at the sanctuary. Her notebook, written in careful script and hidden in her sewing basket for 40 years, documented over 60 cases of children who simply disappeared from the facility between 1889 and 1893. Her attempts to verify their supposed placements through discreet inquiries in the Salem community yielded no results. None of the local families she contacted had received children from the sanctuary during this period. The seamstress eventually approached Father Michael O'Brien, pastor of Salem's Catholic Church, with her concerns. O'Brien, who maintained cordial relations with Protestant institutions in the community, agreed to make subtle inquiries about the missing children. His investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. Other charitable organizations and placement agencies throughout New England had no record of receiving transferred children from the Grimsley Sanctuary. The institution appeared to operate in complete isolation from the broader network of child welfare organizations. Father O'Brien's formal complaint to the Massachusetts Department of Public Welfare, filed in January 1894, marked the first official challenge to the sanctuary's operations. His letter detailed specific cases of children who had allegedly been placed with Catholic families but never arrived at their destinations. He requested a comprehensive audit of the institution's placement records and transfers. The department's response, while polite, effectively rejected his concerns. Dr. Grimsley's stellar reputation and the sanctuary's impeccable record of compliance with state regulations made such an investigation unnecessary. The rejection of Father O'Brien's complaint reflected broader social dynamics that protected the sanctuary from scrutiny. Dr. Grimsley's supporters included some of Massachusetts' most powerful families, men who controlled banks, newspapers, and political organizations. Challenging the institution meant challenging this network of influence, a prospect that few officials were willing to contemplate. The sanctuary's charitable mission and obvious wealth provided additional insulation against criticism. Medical anomalies continued to surface despite the lack of official investigation. Dr. Samuel Warren, a rural physician who occasionally treated former sanctuary residents, documented unusual patterns of injury and illness among these children. Many showed signs of chronic malnutrition despite the institution's reputation for excellent care. Others displayed what Warren characterized as systematic physical deterioration, inconsistent with normal childhood development. Most disturbing were the behavioral symptoms: extreme compliance, inability to make independent decisions, and what Warren described as learned helplessness, typically associated with severe psychological trauma. Dr. Warren's detailed case notes, preserved in his family's papers, revealed his growing conviction that something fundamental was wrong at the sanctuary. His attempts to discuss these concerns with colleagues met with polite but firm resistance. The medical community's loyalty to Dr. Grimsley, combined with his prestigious position and scholarly reputation, made criticism professionally dangerous. Warren found himself increasingly isolated as he pursued his investigation into the sanctuary's practices. The isolation of potential critics proved to be one of Dr. Grimsley's most effective defensive strategies. Individual observers might notice troubling patterns, but the institution's reputation prevented coordination among skeptics. Each concerned party, whether clergy, physicians, or community members, found themselves questioning their own perceptions when confronted with the overwhelming support the sanctuary enjoyed from respected authorities. Transportation records provided another source of troubling evidence. Railway clerks who handled shipments to and from the sanctuary reported irregularities in the facility's supply orders. Medical supplies arrived in quantities that seemed excessive for an institution housing fewer than 100 children at any given time. Chemical shipments included substances not typically associated with childcare or education. Most puzzling were the regular deliveries of specialized equipment ordered through medical supply companies in Boston and New York. These observations might have remained isolated curiosities, but one railway clerk, Harold Price, began maintaining unofficial records of the sanctuary's shipments. His logbook, discovered in his descendant's attic in 1962, revealed a pattern of suspicious deliveries that accelerated dramatically in the early 1890s. Chemicals normally used in research laboratories, surgical instruments far beyond what the facility's infirmary required, and mechanical devices whose purpose Price could not determine all arrived at the sanctuary with increasing frequency. Rice's attempts to share his observations with local authorities met with the same dismissive response that characterized other early warnings about the institution. Dr. Grimsley's scientific reputation provided ready explanations for unusual supply orders. He was conducting important research into child development and therapeutic techniques. The equipment supported his innovative approaches to education and medical care. Any citizen should feel proud that such advanced work was being conducted in their community. The accumulation of ignored warnings created an atmosphere of frustrated helplessness among the sanctuary's potential critics. Each individual observer possessed fragments of a larger, disturbing picture, but the institution's protective network prevented these fragments from coalescing into effective opposition. Dr. Grimsley's carefully constructed public image, reinforced by powerful supporters and institutional prestige, proved remarkably effective at deflecting scrutiny. By 1895, more than a decade after the sanctuary's founding, a substantial body of evidence suggested serious problems within the institution. Clergy members, physicians, law enforcement officials, and community members had all documented troubling patterns and raised legitimate concerns. Yet the facility continued to operate without meaningful oversight, its reputation intact, and its methods unquestioned by those with the authority to intervene. The stage was set for the horror that investigators would eventually uncover in the Gothic granite building surrounded by Massachusetts pines. Horror uncovered. The first crack in the sanctuary's facade came from an unexpected source, a fire in the institution's records building on March 12, 1901. While volunteer firefighters battled the blaze that consumed administrative offices, a Salem deputy sheriff named Carl Bennett discovered a steel door hidden behind a false wall in the basement. The door, secured with multiple locks and bearing no identifying marks, led to a corridor that did not appear on any architectural plans of the facility. Bennett's subsequent exploration of this hidden area revealed the beginning of what would eventually be recognized as one of the most systematic programs of child abuse in American history. The corridor led to a series of rooms that bore no resemblance to the comfortable dormitories and cheerful classrooms that visitors to the sanctuary had always seen. These spaces, carved from the building's granite foundation, contained equipment that Bennett initially struggled to identify. Metal tables equipped with leather restraints, glass cabinets filled with surgical instruments, and a collection of devices that appeared designed to inflict precise amounts of physical pain filled rooms that reeked of chemical preservatives and human suffering. Most disturbing were the detailed records maintained in these hidden chambers. Dr. Grimsley had documented his work with scientific precision, creating files on every child who entered the sanctuary's special programs. These records, written in Grimsley's careful handwriting and supplemented with photographs and medical diagrams, revealed that the physician had been conducting systematic experiments on the children under his care for nearly 2 decades. The experiments fell into several distinct categories, each meticulously planned and rigorously documented. Physical endurance tests measured children's capacity to withstand pain, cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Psychological manipulation studies explored techniques for breaking down individual will and establishing complete obedience. Medical procedures, often performed without anesthesia, tested the limits of human healing and surgical intervention. Most horrifying were what Grimsley termed hereditary correction protocols, attempts to modify children's fundamental characteristics through a combination of physical intervention and psychological conditioning. Deputy Bennett's initial report to Salem Police Chief Raymond Elliott described findings so disturbing that Elliott initially questioned the deputy's mental stability. The carefully documented torture of children, presented in the language of scientific inquiry, challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and institutional authority. Elliott contacted the Massachusetts State Police, requesting immediate assistance with what he characterized as crimes beyond the scope of local investigation. The state investigation, led by Detective Inspector Albert Fisher, expanded rapidly as the scope of Dr. Grimsley's activities became clear. Fisher's team discovered that the hidden basement complex extended far beyond the rooms Bennett had initially found. A network of chambers, connected by narrow passages cut through the building's foundation, housed equipment and records documenting experiments on hundreds of children over the course of nearly 20 years. The most damning evidence came from Grimsley's personal journals, recovered from a hidden safe in his private office. These volumes, bound in leather and written in a code that investigators eventually deciphered, revealed the physician's complete lack of regard for the children under his care. He described his subjects as specimens and research materials, documenting their responses to various forms of torture with the same detached precision he might have used to record laboratory findings on mice or rabbits. One journal entry, dated September 15, 1889, described an experiment on a 7-year-old boy identified only as Subject 23M. Grimsley had methodically inflicted increasingly severe burns on the child's arms and legs, documenting healing rates and pain tolerance. The experiment continued for 6 weeks, during which the boy was denied adequate food and medical care to determine how these factors affected recovery. The final entry noted that Subject 23M expired due to systemic infection, with no indication that Grimsley considered this outcome anything more than a research setback. Similar entries filled dozens of journals spanning the entire history of the sanctuary. Children were subjected to extreme temperatures, surgical procedures without anesthesia, psychological torture designed to destroy their sense of identity, and pharmaceutical experiments. Using compounds that Grimsley ordered from European chemical suppliers, the physician maintained detailed statistical analyses of mortality rates, healing patterns, and psychological breakdown timelines, treating the systematic destruction of young lives as an fascinating intellectual exercise. The discovery of these records prompted an immediate search for surviving victims of Grimsley's experiments. State investigators, working with local law enforcement agencies throughout New England, attempted to locate children who had officially been placed with families or transferred to other institutions. This search revealed that the vast majority of children who left the sanctuary had simply vanished. Official records indicated successful placements, but no corresponding documentation existed in the supposed destination communities. Of the few survivors investigators managed to locate, most were found in deplorable conditions. Many had been sold to factories or farms as unpaid laborers, their identities completely erased and their capacity for independent thought systematically destroyed. Others wandered through urban areas as homeless adults, unable to form relationships or maintain employment due to the psychological damage inflicted during their time at the sanctuary. A handful had been placed with families who used them as domestic servants, valuing their absolute obedience and lack of personal will. The testimony of these survivors provided horrifying details about daily life within the sanctuary's hidden programs. Children were routinely awakened in the middle of the night for special lessons that involved systematic torture and humiliation. Those who showed signs of resistance were subjected to increasingly severe punishments until their will was completely broken. Medical procedures were performed without explanation or anesthesia, often for the sole purpose of causing pain and establishing dominance. One survivor, a woman named Dorothy Hughes, who had been held at the sanctuary from 1885 to 1892, provided investigators with the most detailed account of Grimsley's methods. Hughes, interviewed in a Boston tenement where she lived in poverty and isolation, described a systematic program designed to destroy every aspect of normal child development. Children were forbidden to form friendships, denied adequate food and sleep, and subjected to constant surveillance designed to prevent any form of independent thought or action. Hughes recalled specific experiments that Grimsley had conducted on her and other children. Starvation studies measured how long children could survive on minimal nutrition while performing physical labor. Temperature experiments locked children in unheated rooms during Massachusetts winters or exposed them to extreme heat during summer months. Psychological manipulation included deliberate lies about children's families, false promises of adoption, and elaborate deceptions designed to destroy their ability to trust any adult. Authority. The physical evidence discovered in the sanctuary's hidden chambers corroborated these testimonies in gruesome detail. Investigators found bone fragments, preserved tissue samples, and photographic evidence of experiments that challenged their fundamental assumptions about human cruelty. Chemical analysis of substances found in the facility revealed compounds designed to cause specific types of pain, disability, and psychological disorientation. Medical equipment included devices obviously designed for torture rather than treatment. Most disturbing were the detailed anatomical studies that Grimsley had conducted on deceased children. The physician had performed extensive dissections, documenting the physical effects of his experiments with scientific precision. Preserved organs showed evidence of systematic damage caused by chemical exposure, malnutrition, and physical trauma. Skeletal remains revealed patterns of injury, consistent with prolonged torture and abuse. The investigation expanded to include examination of the sanctuary's official records and financial accounts. This analysis revealed an elaborate system of fraud designed to conceal the true nature of the institution's activities. Official enrollment records bore little resemblance to the actual number of children held at the facility. Financial documents showed payments for supplies and equipment that were never used for legitimate educational or medical purposes. Correspondence with government officials contained systematic lies about the institution's operations and outcomes. Dr. Grimsley's own behavior during the investigation provided additional evidence of his complete lack of normal human empathy. When confronted with evidence of his crimes, he showed no remorse or recognition that his actions constituted wrongdoing. Instead, he expressed frustration that his research had been interrupted and concern that his scientific findings might be lost. He attempted to negotiate with investigators, offering to share his experimental results in exchange for leniency. The physician's complete absence of moral understanding extended to his interactions with survivors of his experiments. When Dorothy Hughes was brought to confront him during questioning, Grimsley expressed satisfaction at her survival and inquired about the long-term effects of procedures he had performed on her as a child. He seemed genuinely puzzled by her emotional distress and suggested that she should feel honored to have contributed to important scientific advancement. The scope of Grimsley's crimes eventually encompassed nearly every child who had entered the sanctuary since its founding in 1882. Investigators estimated that over 300 children had been subjected to systematic torture, with fewer than 50 surviving to adulthood. The mortality rate among sanctuary residents far exceeded that of any legitimate institution, but Grimsley's careful manipulation of records had concealed this devastating statistic from public view. The investigation also revealed the complicity of several staff members who had assisted Grimsley in his experiments. Head nurse Margaret Wells had administered drugs and assisted with surgical procedures on children. Teacher William Harris had identified children who showed signs of intelligence or independence, marking them for more severe treatment. House mother Ruth Palmer had maintained discipline through systematic psychological torture, breaking down children's resistance to prepare them for Grimsley's experiments. The evidence collected by state investigators filled dozens of boxes and provided documentation for what prosecutors characterized as the most extensive case of institutionalized child abuse in American history. The systematic nature of Grimsley's crimes, combined with their duration and the number of victims involved, challenged existing legal frameworks for addressing such horrific wrongdoing. The case would require new approaches to prosecution and punishment, assuming that justice could ever adequately address such monstrous crimes against children. Legacy and silence. The arrest of Dr. Cornelius Grimsley on April 3, 1901, should have marked the beginning of a comprehensive reckoning with the systematic torture and murder of hundreds of children. Instead, it initiated an equally systematic campaign to bury the truth and protect the powerful men and women whose reputations depended on the sanctuary's supposed legitimacy. Within hours of Grimsley's detention, a coordinated effort began to limit public knowledge of his crimes and minimize their impact on Massachusetts society. Judge Harrison Lowell, chairman of the sanctuary's board of directors, convened an emergency meeting of Boston's most influential families on the evening of Grimsley's arrest. The gathering, held in the private dining room of the Somerset Club, included bank presidents, industrial magnates, newspaper publishers, and political leaders whose donations had supported the institution for nearly 2 decades. The minutes of this meeting, discovered in 1987 among papers donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society, revealed a cold calculation about protecting reputations and limiting financial liability. The strategy that emerged from this meeting prioritized damage control over justice. Newspaper coverage would be minimized through direct pressure on publishers and editors. Legal proceedings would be managed to focus on Grimsley's individual culpability while avoiding examination of institutional oversight failures. Survivors would be relocated away from Massachusetts and provided with financial incentives to avoid public testimony. Most importantly, all physical evidence from the sanctuary would be destroyed to prevent future investigations or civil lawsuits. The implementation of this cover-up began immediately. Within a week of Grimsley's arrest, the hidden chambers beneath the sanctuary were sealed with concrete. Workers, imported from New York and paid extraordinary wages for their silence, destroyed equipment, burned records, and obliterated any trace of the experiments that had been conducted on the facility's grounds. The official explanation claimed that structural damage from the March fire required extensive foundation repairs. Newspaper coverage of Grimsley's crimes proved remarkably limited and consistently misleading. The Boston Globe, whose publisher had contributed generously to the sanctuary, ran a single article describing the arrest as related to financial irregularities at the institution. The Salem Herald published a brief notice about administrative problems that would result in the facility's temporary closure. No newspaper mentioned the discovery of torture chambers, experimental equipment, or evidence of systematic child murder. The Massachusetts Attorney General's office, led by prosecutor Eugene Hoffman, faced enormous pressure to limit the scope of the criminal investigation. Hoffman, whose own family had donated to the sanctuary, found himself caught between the demands of justice and the reality of political influence. His correspondence with state police investigators, uncovered decades later, revealed his growing awareness that a full prosecution of Grimsley's crimes would implicate dozens of prominent citizens who had ignored obvious warning signs. The legal strategy ultimately adopted by the Attorney General's office focused narrowly on Grimsley's individual actions while avoiding any examination of broader institutional failure. Charges were limited to specific incidents for which physical evidence existed, ignoring the vast majority of documented crimes. The prosecution agreed to a plea arrangement that would spare the state the embarrassment of a public trial, accepting Grimsley's guilty plea to reduce charges in exchange for a life sentence at the state prison in Charlestown. The plea hearing, conducted in closed session on September 12, 1901, lasted less than an hour. Judge Samuel Warren, presiding over the case, accepted Grimsley's admission of guilt to charges of manslaughter and child endangerment, while dismissing more serious charges of murder and torture. The brief court record, sealed for 75 years, contained no mention of the hundreds of children who had died under Grimsley's care or the systematic nature of his experimental program. Surviving victims of Grimsley's experiments found themselves actively discouraged from seeking justice or public acknowledgement of their suffering. Dorothy Hughes, whose detailed testimony had provided crucial evidence for investigators, was approached by representatives of the sanctuary's board of directors within days of Grimsley's plea hearing. These men, identifying themselves as lawyers, acting on behalf of concerned charitable organizations, offered her substantial financial compensation in exchange for her agreement never to discuss her experiences publicly. The contract presented to Hughes and to other survivors investigators had located included strict confidentiality clauses that would have resulted in severe financial penalties for any public statements about the sanctuary. The document characterized her experiences as alleged incidents that may have been misinterpreted due to childhood trauma, effectively requiring her to deny the reality of what had been done to her. Hughes, living in poverty and intimidated by the legal language and official pressure, reluctantly signed the agreement. Similar contracts were offered to families of children who had died at the sanctuary. Parents who had entrusted their children to Dr. Grimsley's care, believing they were providing opportunities for education and moral development, found themselves confronted with evidence of systematic torture and murder. The grief and guilt experienced by these families made them vulnerable to legal manipulations that promised financial compensation while demanding silence about their children's fate. The destruction of physical evidence proceeded with remarkable efficiency throughout the summer and fall of 1901. The sanctuary's main building was demolished under the pretense of structural instability, eliminating any possibility of future investigation. The site was cleared and sold to a logging company that harvested the surrounding forest, obliterating the landscape where hundreds of children had suffered and died. Even the granite stones used in the building's construction were shipped to other states, ensuring that no physical remnant of the institution would remain in Massachusetts. Official records of the sanctuary's operations underwent similar destruction. State files documenting the institution's licensing and oversight were removed from archives and reportedly destroyed in a fire at the State House in 1903. Federal records related to the investigation disappeared from government offices in Washington. Even local police files related to runaway children and suspicious deaths were mysteriously lost during routine archive maintenance. The few documents that survived the systematic destruction effort were carefully edited to remove any reference to the scale and systematic nature of Grimsley's crimes. Death certificates for children who died at the sanctuary were altered to indicate disease or accident, rather than torture and murder. Transfer records were modified to suggest successful placements with families, rather than sale into forced labor or death in experimental programs. Medical examiner reports were rewritten to eliminate evidence of systematic abuse. Dr. Grimsley himself proved remarkably cooperative with the cover-up efforts, apparently recognizing that his own interests aligned with those of his former supporters. During his incarceration at Charlestown, he wrote extensively about his experiences, but these writings focused on scientific theories and medical procedures rather than specific details about individual victims. His manuscripts, carefully edited by prison officials before release, portrayed his work as legitimate medical research that had been misunderstood by ignorant authorities. The physician's death in prison on January 15, 1904, eliminated the last direct source of information about the sanctuary's operations. Prison records indicated that Grimsley died of natural causes, specifically heart failure related to the stress of incarceration. However, testimony from other inmates collected decades later by researchers suggested that Grimsley had been poisoned to prevent any future revelations about his work or the people who had supported it. The elimination of Grimsley removed the final obstacle to complete suppression of the sanctuary scandal. News of his death received minimal coverage in Massachusetts newspapers, with most publications running brief obituaries that described him as a pioneering physician, whose career was tragically cut short by personal difficulties. No mention was made of his crimes or their impact on hundreds of children and their families. The success of the cover-up became apparent in the years following Grimsley's death. Public memory of the sanctuary scandal faded rapidly, helped by the deliberate absence of documentation or physical evidence. Children who grew up in Salem during the early 1900s learned nothing about the institution that had operated in their community for nearly 2 decades. Even families of victims found themselves questioning their own memories as official denials and destroyed records made proof impossible. The long-term consequences of the cover-up extended far beyond the immediate protection of reputations and fortunes. The systematic destruction of evidence prevented any meaningful examination of how such extensive crimes could have been ignored for so long. No reforms were implemented to prevent similar abuses at other institutions. No oversight mechanisms were established to protect children in charitable facilities. The lessons that might have been learned from the sanctuary horror were deliberately lost. Survivors of Grimsley's experiments lived with the psychological consequences of their experiences, while being denied any opportunity for public acknowledgement or legal redress. Many struggled with severe mental health problems, inability to form relationships, and chronic physical disabilities, resulting from the torture they had endured as children. The confidentiality agreements they had been pressured to sign prevented them from seeking appropriate treatment or support from others who had shared similar experiences. The effectiveness of the cover-up became a model for suppressing other institutional scandals throughout the early 20th century. Similar techniques, destruction of evidence, pressure on witnesses, and manipulation of official records would be employed repeatedly when powerful institutions faced exposure of criminal behavior. The Grimsley family name disappeared from Massachusetts society after the scandal. Surviving relatives changed their surnames and relocated to distant states, carrying with them the burden of their ancestors' crimes. The family fortune, built on textile manufacturing and maintained through 3 generations, was quietly liquidated and distributed to anonymous charitable organizations. Even the family burial plot in Mount Auburn Cemetery was abandoned, leaving no trace of the Grimsley legacy in New England. Attempts to investigate the sanctuary case resurged periodically throughout the 20th century, usually prompted by researchers or journalists who encountered fragmentary references in archived documents. These efforts invariably failed due to the systematic destruction of evidence and the deaths of potential witnesses. By the 1950s, even the location of the former sanctuary had been forgotten, as the logging company that purchased the site had altered the landscape beyond recognition. The final chapter of the Grimsley scandal came in 1987, when demolition crews preparing to clear land for a shopping center in Salem discovered human remains buried in what had once been the sanctuary's grounds. The bones, many showing evidence of systematic trauma and medical intervention, provided physical confirmation of the crimes that had been so carefully hidden 8 decades earlier. Forensic analysis identified remains from at least 47 children, though investigators suspected that many more bodies remained undiscovered. The 1987 discovery prompted renewed interest in the Grimsley case, but official response remained muted. The Massachusetts Attorney General's office conducted a brief review of available evidence, concluding that the passage of time made any meaningful investigation impossible. The remains were quietly interred in a mass grave at a local cemetery, marked only with a simple stone bearing no names or explanation of their significance. Today, the site where the Grimsley Children's Sanctuary once stood houses a suburban shopping plaza. Families shop for groceries, and children play in the parking lot where hundreds of their predecessors suffered and died. No historical marker acknowledges what happened here. No memorial honors the victims. The pines that once surrounded the Gothic granite building have been replaced by asphalt and concrete. But sometimes, according to local residents, the wind through the remaining trees still carries sounds that seem almost like children's. Voices, whispers that remind anyone willing to listen that some secrets refuse to stay buried forever. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So, leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget. But we insist on remembering